Please welcome our first Peace Corps veteran, Michael McCaskey.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you all, and on behalf of Maureen and me, we want to say how pleased we are to be here today, and we want to thank the very helpful staff of the Chicago Humanities Festival that have made our preparation for coming here so easy. We have only an hour, and for us to talk about what was for each of us a very rich 2-year experience that's affected the whole rest of our lives, an hour is barely enough. And we thought maybe the best way to do it would be for me to start by spending about 10 minutes talking about my Peace Corps experience in a remote village in Ethiopia, and then Maureen would follow talking about her experience as a Peace Corps volunteer in Colombia. And then we thought we'd have a conversation between the two of us for a little while, and then what might be the best part, throw it open to questions and comments from you in the audience. Now, why did I join the Peace Corps? You have to go back to 1964. I was in my senior year of college. I was feeling very fortunate in my life's travels since my life experiences up to that point, and I wanted to give something back. The idea of the Peace Corps appealed very strongly to me. The idea of serving in another country at the grassroots and to try and work people to make some situations better. I would also say that I wanted to learn a new foreign language, something completely different and outside of the Indo-European family of languages, because I wanted to see the world insofar as it's possible with a new set of eyes. I was especially interested in Africa in those years, and I think that comes from an idea that now seems rather naive, that during those Cold War years when Russia and the United States were faced off against each other, some people thought perhaps Africa could play a role as an honest broker or a moral force between the two great superpowers. Well, the Peace Corps invitation came late when it did come, and it was to Niger. But there was a postscript that said, if you'd like to serve as a teacher in Ethiopia, you can do that. So that's what I jumped on. The name of my town was Fiche. It was a small town. Back then it was about 5,000 people, and it was 70 kilometers north of the capital city, Addis Ababa. But because transportation was so uncertain and haphazard, it was considered somewhat remote. It took a while to get there. It was a beautiful country, is a beautiful country. It's on a highland plateau, which just perfectly balances out its proximity to the equator. So the weather was much like San Diego. Every day, sunshine, blue skies, 70 degrees, and a beautiful rolling countryside. Most of the people were engaged in farming or farm-related activities. And their style of plowing the land goes back hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, to a scratch plow drawn by 2 oxen. It was among the poorest countries in the world. People were accustomed to walking barefoot 5, 7, or more miles to get to the marketplace, and my students were like that as well. They would walk barefoot 5 to 7 miles each day, morning and night, to get to school. They'd carry their shoes so they wouldn't wear out the shoe leather. We were very fortunate in that the students were eager and serious and hardworking. The school was also quite nice. It was a newly built school, stone walls, glass windows, tin roof. One thing to notice here is the slant of the field. I'll come back to that. The students were so dedicated because education was really, in practical terms, their only way up in society. So they knew they had to make the most of their opportunity, and they were very grateful to the faculty who could help them along the way. It was my first time teaching, so there were long nights and in preparation and long days in teaching. I'd like to say a few words about how I taught science in my school. The traditional classroom was for students to learn by rote. The teacher would typically fill the blackboard with writing that would be copied in their notebooks, and the students would be responsible for memorizing it and playing it back in the exams. I wanted to take a very different approach and have them problem solve. So that, for example, to teach a unit on electricity, I divided the students into small groups, gave them each a flashlight battery, a small length of wire, and a flashlight bulb. And I said, your job is to figure out how to light that bulb. And then I didn't say anything else. Well, that was a bit of a challenge to students who were only used to the rote learning method. But one of the groups working on the problem came up with a solution, and that idea spread through the other groups, and the students got very excited to see how they could carry it further. So that, for example, the metal frames of the chairs, they started to see if they could run the current through the metal frame of the chair. The boys commandeered batteries from the girls, created a long line of batteries, braided together the wires, and found they could pop the flashlight bulbs. I thought that was very clever, but we had only a few flashlight bulbs, plus the girls needed their batteries back. So we continued through the year with that kind of approach in mind. Give them problems, challenge them to solve them, and it seemed to be a kind of learning that they really took to. They got pretty good at it. Another thing that was very important for the school was our relationship with parents. If a child's going to be at school in this town, it meant there was one less pair of hands to work on the farm. So that meant, to whatever extent was possible, we had to keep before the parents the value of the school and how it was worth their sacrifice to have their child attend the school. So each year there was a Parents' Day and a wide variety of fun contests, including a tug of war. Now, you remember the slant of the field outside the school? I'd assumed that we would pull across the slant, so neither team would have an advantage. Not the Ethiopian way. There was always one team that was downhill. So for the first tug of war, the parents were downhill. And they won. So they were able to call over to the teachers, you may be smart, but we are the strong ones. We can. And then we swapped positions, and the teachers downhill won the next pull. And we could say, hey, not only are we clever and smart, but we are strong too. And then the third and deciding tug of war, they were downhill, and they won it. And I was very upset about the unfairness of it all for quite a long time. And it was something I had to learn about. It was one of my more important personal learnings, and I can tell you about that a little bit later. For years, these are my students, for years, a Peace Corps buddy of mine, Mark Foster, and I had talked about going back. Of course, you couldn't go back right away. For a long stretch of years, Ethiopia was ruled by a Marxist government that made it very dangerous to associate with Americans. But finally, a year ago, we returned with family members, and it was a joyous reunion. Here is one of the students I was most eager to see, Tayi Teferi. He was my best student in the 8th grade and my tutor in Amharic, the language of the country. Each day after lunch, we'd work for about an hour, and I tried very hard to improve my ability to speak the local language. Tayi went on to get a PhD in zoology and is now a director of the World Wildlife Fund in Kenya. And this from a very small, remote village. When I met up with him and the other students. His brother, this is Tayi on the right, and his brother, Miss Russia, who was the best student in the 7th grade. It was just great fun. I had brought along a photo book of some of the black and white photos that you had seen, and that was a big, big hit. Here's Abi on the left, who is a very successful lawyer, and Lakau, who teaches in the commercial school. Zalalam is on the left. He's a soil chemist who has his own company. So can you imagine a greater joy for a teacher to come back 47 years later and to find that your former students had done so very well under some very challenging conditions? Of course, I wanted to go back to my old school. The students, my former students, insisted on coming with, so we formed a convoy to travel up there of about 4 cars. Here's my daughter, Catherine, who I was very pleased to have make the trip with me, and some of the students. And we arrived in Fiche, and wow, had the town changed from 5,000 to maybe, nobody's really sure, maybe 50,000. Had a commercial bank. This is the sign at the commercial bank. And the students at the old school were out in force to greet and to welcome Mark and me. Presented with flowers, and Mark and I made some welcoming remarks. It was really a wonderful, wonderful reunion. There were some sad notes. This is the library that back in my day had been well-stocked and well-used. My dad had made a very generous gift. And now it had fallen on tough times in that there were no new books, and a lot of the ones there were just about useless. The most exciting thing for me was a water faucet. When I arrived in Fiche, there was no running water and no electricity, and now I came back, there was, in some limited cases, running water and a telecommunications tower. Cell phones, except a satellite feed, just wonderful. And I wanted to visit the house that I had stayed in. This is the house, my 2nd year, close to the school. And I asked permission to poke my head in the door just to see what it looked like. And I was stunned to see a large screen color TV in operation. It wasn't like that when I was preparing lesson plans by candlelight. I have just a few minutes left, and I want to mention 3 things real quickly. I'm sometimes asked about maintaining any connections to Ethiopia on account of my Peace Corps service. Let me mention these 3 very quickly. First off, about 5 or 6 years ago, it looked like Ethiopia and its small neighbor to the north, Eritrea, were headed toward war. A group of 5 former volunteers traveled to both countries, used the goodwill that the Peace Corps had built up over the years, and arranged to speak with the top leaders of both countries in an effort to move the dispute to a negotiation table. We were not successful. They had a war. We were invited to the ceasefire agreement that was signed in Algeria. Secondly, last June, I was part of a faculty that had a training event on leading change for Ethiopian cabinet ministers and state ministers and their staff. We designed a highly interactive session with a lot of good and thoughtful discussion, and I thought that the event was a 3-day event, went a long way toward fostering a spirit of communication and collaboration among the ministries. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister, who's the top person in Ethiopia, passed away a short time after the event, and things are now at kind of a standstill. In Chicago, there's a sizable Ethiopian community, and I'm very pleased that 4 representatives of the Ethiopian Community Association of Chicago are with us here tonight. The executive director is Dr. Erku Yimmer, and the community is very lucky to have such a good leader at the helm. And he has instituted computer training and entrepreneurship training to help with the challenge of providing better work opportunities for a group of people who are often highly educated, are hardworking, and deserve the opportunity to have better jobs. They've also started an Ethiopian cultural center right on the north side of Chicago, where items of cultural significance and classes on language and culture can teach young Ethiopians about their cultural heritage. It's also useful for American parents who've adopted Ethiopian children. Dr. Urku is here with us tonight, and if you want to talk to him about the Cultural Center, I'm sure he would welcome inquiries. Now, this has been way too quick, I understand it, tried to cover a lot of territory in 10 minutes, but I hope in the question and answer session that if there's particular areas that you want to explore further with what I say or what Maureen says, that you'll make it a point to ask questions there. Now I have the great pleasure to turn over the podium and the microphone to Maureen Orth, who had a very interesting 2 years in Columbia, and I hope, Maureen, you'll be able to come out and tell us about that. Sure.
And the reason I joined was really, I think, because I wanted to serve, of course, but also because the opportunities for women in those days were extremely limited. And just the idea of being able to go somewhere for 2 years, and whatever happened at the end of those 2 years is because you made it happen, was appealing to me, as well as learning another language and living in another completely different culture. And I too had the good fortune of being assigned to a city. Medellin at that time was 900,000 people, and it's a long valley surrounded by mountains, much like Los Angeles, and is called the City of Eternal Springs. So I also had a beautiful climate to be in, and I lived as a community organizer in a barrio outside the city. And then about 2 miles up from the barrio was what they call a vereda, which is a small village that needed a school. And that's where my school was built and came from. And so what I'm going to do now is show you the Peace Corps postcard that we made about my school. And this is part of a series that you can go online to see. If you go on to peacecorpspostcards.com, you can go from Mongolia to Morocco, Mexico, Costa Rica, China. I had such a fascinating experience last year making those videos. So we're going to start with this, and then we'll come back. Thank you.
Among those who answered President Kennedy's call in the mid-1960s was a young woman from San Francisco named Maureen Orth. Maureen was assigned to work in a small village in the Andes Mountains, high above the city of Medellin.
In those days, women didn't have a whole lot they could do, and I was just thirsting for adventure, and I found everything I wanted here. One day, a posse of men came, 5 of them on horseback, with a horse for me. They knocked on my door and brought me up the mountain for the first time, and they said, "We want to build a school, and we need to figure out how to do it."
With donated construction materials from the Coffee Growers Association, together they carved out a site on the side of a mountain and built the community's first school.
It took us about a year to build the first 2-classroom school.
The people expressed their profound gratitude by naming the school Escuela Marina Orth.
Even today, when I come up the mountain, I can barely get through it without starting to cry or my throat catches. It has such emotion for me. As soon as I start climbing up here, my heart starts beating.
For many years, when Medellin was the drug capital of the world, it was too dangerous for Maureen to visit the school she helped build. When she returned in 2004, she was asked by the Secretary of Education to help make Escuela Marina Orth the first bilingual public school in Colombia.
He said, "Look, these kids aren't going to have a chance to compete in the world unless they know English and unless they know computers.
Today, we are inaugurating the One Laptop per Child project at our school, Marina Orth.
A few years later, Escuela Marina Orth also became the first one laptop per child school in Colombia.
Busca 7 más 7 el resultado ahí.
Oh, you got it, 14. You did it. The computers have made a huge difference in these children's lives because for the first time they own something that they realize is extremely valuable, that is a tool for them to go so far beyond what they could have dreamed of. And as a result, they realize their own value more. And their parents are so excited to have this special tool in their house.
Están ocupados ahí siempre aprendiendo. Igual uno aprende de ellos. Yo he aprendido mucho.
Good morning.
No es una de las mejores, es la mejor. Es una maravilla, es lo mejor que hay acá.
So it's really bringing the world, the entire world of the internet is being brought to this very isolated community high in the Andes, and it's a huge transformation.
¿Y qué están aprendiendo? ¿Ah? ¿Sí? Muchas cosas.
She's a great friend of Colombia, and she comes to the school very often, and it's a great work that she has done.
Today, the Marina Orth Foundation supports 3 schools with more than 1,200 students.
I think, obviously, this school and these children and the ability to allow them to dream a life that they could never have imagined before, that's surely the most important thing I've ever done in my life, except having my son.
What I'm going to do now is just talk to you a little bit about the foundation and my coming back, and there'll be a slide. We're going to have a loop of slides running that show the locations and the children in the 3 different schools. And the first school, of course, is Escuela Marina Orth. The second school is about an hour and a half outside of Medellin, a rural school called Campo Alegre in El Carmen de Viboral. And then the third school is Llananditas, which is high up in the Andes, overlooking the city of Medellin, which has a lot of displaced people that have come from the violence. But Colombia, so we can cue the slides to go behind me. Colombia is really coming through in a very interesting way right now. They're in the middle of peace talks with the FARC. They began recently to see if they can end this guerrilla warfare that has occurred for 50 years. And it's very interesting about Latin America as well, because Latin America has grown so much and it's so overlooked most of the time by the United States. But if Latin America develops for the next 15 years at the same rate that it has developed for the last 10 in terms of GDP, it now has gone from 1/2 of its population in poverty to 1/3. And if it continues on the same rate, they will only have 1/10 of their population in poverty in 15 years, and they will have 500 million people emerging into the middle class. They are very eager to progress and to learn. And these kids studying with these computers are really, we are training them for the new world and the new labor force and the challenges that they will be facing. However, we do it with public-private partnerships so that the Colombian government usually gives us about 40%, then private Colombian money 30%, and then 30% comes from US funds. And we've had large corporations like Chevron and General Mills and Hewlett-Packard, et cetera, help us. And we are also now, in order to sustain the foundation and grow it even more, we are now training teachers in other parts of the country in the use of the computer, and we are trying to really reform education that way, because teacher training is extremely important, because it doesn't matter how many computers you have if you don't have the teachers using them properly in the classroom. But we have really that's the second school, that's the rural school. But we also use smart boards in the classroom, and the kids take the computers home, And so they also teach their parents. And we now have 200 families on Facebook in my school in Marina Orth, and about 190 in this school. And it's just amazing how fast social media is spreading. It's absolutely wonderful. And Medellin has become a very much safer place. The reason I couldn't go to my school for so long was that because Pablo Escobar was hiding out down the road. And it simply wasn't safe. But today we have US volunteers, young people for the most part, come and teach English and help us, and it's wonderful for the kids to hear native speakers. We also have former Peace Corps volunteers that I'll talk about later who also come visit us and give their time. So it's a wonderful exchange, and the Colombians are so grateful to have, the Americans tell me they've never been in a more friendly place in their lives, and it's a very exciting thing. So for me, who started in the Peace Corps, where I really learned a tremendous amount about my own profession that I never realized I was ever going to be a journalist, but having gone into the Peace Corps, I learned how to listen, I learned how to put myself into other people's shoes, I learned what became my rules for journalism, which I call the EAP rule, which is energy, enthusiasm, empathy, prepared, polite, persistent, because you really don't succeed in the Peace Corps unless you're really, really persistent. And I just think that to have been able to resurrect this whole Peace Corps experience once again, decades later, has been one of the most valuable things in my life. And I was very excited when he's sitting right down there, Howard Elegant and his wife Carol. Howard was a Peace Corps volunteer with me in Medellin. He was an architect. And he and his wife have come to visit and volunteer at my schools the last several winters. To escape the Chicago winter, he comes to the city of eternal spring. And he befriended a young man named Marlon Vargas, who was 14 years old and made his first trip out, really almost outside of Medellin, his first trip on an airplane. And Howard and Carol brought him to Chicago this summer, and he had the time of his life. And Marlon is proficient in technology as well as learning English at a very rapid clip, and he prepared a Prezi for his Prezi, for those of you, it's one step beyond Facebook and everything. It's like an animated slideshow. And he prepared a Prezi for about his summer in Chicago, which I'm not gonna, I will narrate. I've corrected his English a little bit and shortened it, but we're gonna see the Prezi that Marlon made about you. During my stay in Evanston, Illinois, I had an opportunity that I never imagined. Thanks to many angels in my life, I opened my eyes to the world and I started to fly on an unstoppable flight. My first dream came true when I met my American family and the doors opened for me. Each day I learned something new and my life definitely changed. I lived with Mr. Howard and Mrs. Carol Elegant, my angels. I met a lot of new friends from all over the world. I learned about an American culture and many other cultures that you can find there. There is a messenger waiting for us to take us to posterity. We need to think more, act more, and to walk into the future without thinking about the poverty of our communities and our minds. So this trip to Chicago lit this unbelievable firecracker under Marlon. And now he's gone back, and I think there must be something about the Chicago political water, because now he wants to go study law and run for president of Colombia. And he sent me something the other day, and it might as well be a platform in this, we're at perfect political time for this. And this is from Marlon. Someday, I want to put a smile on the face of each Colombian kid. I want my name to go down in history as the man who brought peace to the new generations. I want to have a life that gives hope to people, and I know the best way to achieve is to study and acquire the most knowledge possible. The important thing is to use my knowledge in an ethical way. Now, I just can't imagine better goals and values, and to think that Marlon feels that way, and he's been given this opportunity, and we can trace it all the way back to the 1960s when Howard and I were in Medellin. I'm very pleased. Nothing could make me happier or more proud than to see how we've at least influenced this one life. Thank you.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Well, there's so much there. I'm particularly intrigued with the one laptop per child and what gateways that opens. And of course, we've read recently about the effort to create a $50 tablet for India and Africa and presumably for South America. What kind of effect you see that having on your 3 schools and other 3 schools in Columbia?
Well, what you have to consider is that the average amount of money probably spent per student is under $100 a year. And what we've been able to do with our laptops is we have a program called Book in a Bag, and there's all these wonderful programs. And so we're downloading all these classics in Spanish and many in English. And so the kids are reading Journey to the Center of the Earth and Mark Twain on their computers. They never would have been able to read like that. And the newest trend in education in the developing world, which is still a few years away, but the computers might even be outdated at some point, not in the terribly near far future, because they'll be taught by apps and cell phones. That seems to be the fastest spreading way.
Well, it would make it more manageable, wouldn't it, if it were something smaller and more portable?
Yes, but nothing really so far. Distance learning is also coming. A lot of the top schools now are offering a lot of their top courses online, but of course if you can't speak English, then that doesn't, doesn't help so much. But we still don't know what the effects will be without having really the teacher in the classroom. The teacher is still very key. So it
goes back to teacher training.
It goes back to teacher training.
How important that is.
It really is, and the principal. You have to have really enthusiastic and you just really need enthusiastic teachers and principals. The third school has 45 kids in a classroom. And, but with the smart boards and with the computers, they're just so excited to go to school. Otherwise, they have one little paper notebook and one pencil, and that's it. And they learn by rote, and they kind of just turn off. So I just want to stress how important it is to believe in these kids and to pay attention to Latin America, because it's in our time zone. They share our values, and their average age is 27. And they're going to be a huge, huge market for us. And China is already the largest trading partner of Brazil. So I think we have to pay more attention. But one thing I wanted to talk to you about, Mike, is Africa, because I do think there's a lot more attention paid to Africa now, and they too are going through a marvelous progressive time, are they not?
Well, yes and no.
Yes and no.
It's a mixed record, but I'm thinking about how extensive China's influence is in Brazil. Right next to my little town of Fiche, there is a huge Chinese-owned and operated cement plant. And there are many instances now of foreign investment in Ethiopia, some from Saudi Arabia, others from India, where they're taking very long-term leases, 70, 99 years, to lease land that they will farm. Now, this could be very good in terms of introducing more modern methods of farming in place of the scratch plow, but it'll also place a terrific stress on water resources.
Right.
And rainfall's not very reliable year after year in Ethiopia. So dams, reservoirs are a thought, but now you're damming the Blue Nile, which supplies water to Egypt, and there are potential difficulties there. So this is a very complex problem, and to me points out the need for the kind of global citizens that I think the Peace Corps helps educate. And Marlon is a superb example. I think Tai, my student, is another superb example. And I think that's, to me, both the volunteer himself and herself who becomes more globally attuned, but also the students whose lives we touched.
I think that's true, and I think some of the great things that the Peace Corps really teaches you is to have a much more open mind, and so you become aware of a much larger picture, and hopefully a more caring heart. And I think that one of the things that I learned the most after living in the barrio for a while is because you get to know your neighbors so well, and you get to know your community, and here you are with the at that time, barefoot children, families of 15, 18 children, yet God doesn't discriminate in who gets talent, who gets brains, who gets senses of humor, who gets beauty. It's all across the populations, and we have to remember that. And we're no longer, I think, the United States in a position to sort of dictate anymore dictate terms. So I think it's very important that people get these kinds of experiences like the Peace Corps so that they can then be better global citizens.
Yeah. I can give you a quick story that's a wonderful illustration of that innate ability and skill that's found distributed widely across the population. When I first arrived in Fiji, I was supposed to teach science, but we had no science equipment. I was very excited to learn early on that there was a storeroom of science equipment in a classroom the other side of town, but it was locked up.
Right.
Because if the equipment were broken, then the teacher would have to pay for that equipment, and teachers weren't making much money, and so it was locked up. So I said, well, we'll go over there and bring it back to our classroom. But I hadn't thought ahead as to how we would take all of these very delicate glass flasks and test tubes and the rest of it, and I'm staring there like a dummy trying to, how the road was not really a road, it was a rocky path down and then up to get back to my school. And while I'm struggling with this, one of the students pulled me by the arm and he said, "Come, sir." And he pulled me outside and he began to break off the long grass that was growing outside the classroom. We did have some wooden crates, and he started to pack it in and showed me right away how you could use that as packing material. Well, this was not one of my best students, but a very clever student nonetheless.
And you could have had a styrofoam empire.
Yeah, much better to have grass.
The slide you saw, the little boy with the screwdriver taking apart the computer and putting it back together, it's kind of in the same vein. We have the Monitors Club, where the kids who graduate out of the 5th grade or the 6th grade aren't able to take their computers home anymore because those particular computers are just for preschool up, kindergarten through the 6th grade. So the kids who are just fanatics about computers, but of course can't afford them in their own house, we have more conventional computers, but if they want to take them home, they become members of the Monitors Club. And that little boy that you saw, he and his 2 brothers are all in the Monitors Club. And the father worked in a fluorescent light factory, and the computers went down in the factory. And the father told his boss that his son probably could help him fix the computers. So he brought this kid, he's 9 years old, about this high, to the factory. And the boss obviously was startled because he was expecting somebody maybe 18 years old. And so the kid did it. He fixed the computers, and he got paid for it. So he's very excited now, and he's thinking about becoming a systems engineer. So it's just, it really is. It's fun to see how these different things just happen and take off.
Great. Well, we'd like to now invite questions and comments from members of the audience. You can see 2 microphones down here. Please just come forward and take your turns, and we'll field a few questions.
Well, this question is for both of you, and you were in the Peace Corps at the very beginning, kind of like the early TV broadcasters who had a lot of fun because there wasn't much bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you have noticed whether or not the Peace Corps has gotten more bureaucratic, or whether current volunteers still have the same range of motion that you did.
Yeah. Actually, the Peace Corps in the last few years, especially in the last 3 years, has really undertaken a reform of itself to bring itself up to date in terms of how it supports its volunteers and how it trains them. And I think that for us, it's a completely different world. When Mike and I were in the Peace Corps, well, how long did it take to get one letter from home? I mean, the idea that you
6 weeks if we were lucky.
Right. For me, it was about 2, and it was unheard of to ever even phone home. Well, kids today all go with their laptops, and everybody's involved, and it's a much less isolated kind of an experience. And it's interesting because there's a huge waiting list for Peace Corps countries. And you know, the Peace Corps budget is the size of 5 hours in Iraq. The Peace Corps budget is less than the military marching bands of this country. And there are so many more places we can be. Yes, it's gotten more bureaucratic, at least to my taste it has, but it's also constantly having to modernize itself, and it's had very good leadership the last few years. Aaron Williams from Chicago was the director. He just retired. And the deputy director, Carrie Hessler, is one of 9 members of her family who's been a Peace Corps volunteer, and she's excellent.
Let me just underline part of that. If you have the chance to talk with our elected representatives, both Dick Durbin and Mark Kirk have been wonderful supporters of the Peace Corps. But if you get a chance to put in a good word for boosting the budget, money could not be spent more wisely than this. If you're thinking about long-term investments in global citizens and trying to build a world where people have a better chance of understanding each other, that budget could be substantially increased.
This is for Mr. McCaskey. You said about going back for a reunion of the students and however many years later. I was wondering if there were interim Peace Corps volunteers in your community. I don't know when it was no longer accessible. Were there other Peace Corps volunteers?
In Ethiopia?
But especially your little community, after you left, would they have also been, wanting a reunion and that sort of thing? In addition to yourself and your colleague. Was your colleague there at the same time as you?
He was, but he served in Addis Ababa, the capital city. So
you were the only person in the whole school at that time? You were the only Peace Corps volunteer in your school at that time?
No, there were 3 of us to begin with, and 1 bailed out pretty quickly. And then there were 2 of us through that year, and then 2 the next year as well. And I left in 1967 after my 2 years. And Ralph continued on, and there were Peace Corps volunteers, I think up until 1974, which is when the Marxist government took over and made it impossible for the Peace Corps to stay. So there was a long stretch of years where there were no Peace Corps volunteers in Ethiopia. But then as conditions permitted, we had this great alumni pressure. For a while, the Peace Corps program in Ethiopia was the 2nd largest in the world after only India. So we have hundreds. It's the Ethiopian Peace Corps volunteer mafia out there. And so Peace Corps has returned to Ethiopia and are working in community development, public health, and now getting into teacher training and education. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm a Peace Corps volunteer, a returned Peace Corps volunteer.
From?
1970, Honduras. Science teacher, actually teaching science, future science teachers, be able to teach science my first year. And actually, since the topic is how to serve your country, and looking in the audience, I just want to make sure everybody realizes you're not too old to join the Peace Corps, A. And I imagine there's also probably several other returned Peace Corps volunteers out there. And I just want to mention, I've been overseas twice this year. One of the things is the perseverance and also flexibility. I have been a volunteer consultant in the Farmer to Farmer program in Malawi as well as Bangladesh. I just returned 2 weeks ago from Bangladesh. Wow. This is a program through the USAID funded through the Department of Agriculture, and it takes people with knowledge to go, not as farmers necessarily, management, marketing, and to assist these countries in developing more food security in the Feed the Future program. So I just wanted to mention that. It's not so much for a comment, but just...
No, but you know, it's
Thank you
interesting
very much.
because the latest thing, well, first of all, there's the crisis response program for former volunteers. There are a number of ways that people can volunteer. And I also should mention that it's not always going abroad, because Peace Corps volunteers who come back to this country volunteer at twice the rate of the average population. But the latest thing is the National Peace Corps Association, which is the alumni group, has now started packaged tours of 2 weeks. So if you want to take your vacation, there's this whole thing going on now, I'm sure you probably heard of, called voluntourism. And you can go for 2 weeks and learn about what Peace Corps volunteers and other NGOs are doing, and you can give some days of service as you take your trips.
I was wondering, are there any roles you found yourself playing that you weren't prepared for by the Peace Corps? And how would you recommend that a prospective volunteer would prepare for that type of
Well, I
unexpected?
I have good news and bad news. The bad news is that the 3 months of training I received were about the worst training I'd ever had in my life. With the exception of the language training, which was done by native speakers, Ethiopians, and that was superb. The good news is that the Peace Corps has smartened up over these many years, so the training is a lot better. I still get the strong feeling that no matter how good the training is, there has to be this resiliency and this flexibility and this. And I think that's one of the great things that the Peace Corps does. It calls out young people who are serving, older people who are serving, calls upon pools of energy and creativity that perhaps somebody didn't know they had. And the Peace Corps staff just can't get around to all of these remote locations. That'd be another comment I'd make about the bureaucracy. Kind of the beauty of the Peace Corps is you can be off by yourself, and the bureaucracy can't touch you because it's up to you. You're on your own. So training's gotten better, but it's still, I think the Peace Corps needs volunteers who can figure out a lot of things on their own, find the resources in the local community, or get on the internet, or whatever it takes to find some answers.
When I was in the Peace Corps, the whole idea was and I think this still prevails to a great extent today, it's not what you want to do, it's what the community wants to do. So sometimes that is difficult. So, because maybe they don't see the need for a school necessarily, but they want to build a statue of the Virgin, you know. And so it depends. And the whole idea is you're supposed to work yourself out of a job so that you have people that will be able to do your job or will know how to do your job. But there's just so many added benefits. I was thinking about how you have to learn how to travel. And of course, in my day, it was traveling on $5 a day. And there are all these things that you learn how to do in terms of being flexible and in terms of having to just figure out when no means no, when no means yes, and all these other things. But I have noticed, though, with Peace Corps volunteers, you just go to these you have these amazing exotic scenes and places that nobody else goes, and it's so much fun. And, but I have noticed that most Peace Corps volunteers are incredibly cheap, and they stay cheap for the rest of their lives. because they've learned how to travel on $3 a day.
Well, that brings me to a question.
Yeah.
You probably get approached by a lot of parents or folks who say, gee, my son or daughter is thinking of joining the Peace Corps. Mm-hmm. I don't suppose this is something you'd recommend to everybody, and if you have to be selective in who would make a good volunteer or for whom it would be a good experience, what would be sort of the qualities or...
Well, I think a person has to have a certain level of maturity. Today, people are I mean, for example, young women going, of course, in my day, everybody was conservative, but today they're not as conservative. And if they're going into a very traditional society, you have to kind of be, you have to be very careful and sensitive to the cultural values of the community where you are. That means there's places where girls can't drink and carry on, et cetera, and you have to be very careful about that kind of thing. So you need people who are willing to give up certain things in order to be able to fit into the community. I think that's important. And I think, but it's also important to have a sense of humor, and it's also important to like people, and to have a certain, be able to amuse yourself, because there's a lot of long, dreary times at night and things if you're all alone in a little village, and you just have to learn a different way when you're not constantly, unless, you know, surrounded by all the stuff we have.
Would it be a bigger challenge today with young
so.
folks who've grown up in the middle of the swirl of multimedia?
If they don't have, if they're not wired, yeah, probably, I think. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? If not, we've got just about 3 or 4 minutes, Maureen, to say anything that you'd like to really emphasize.
Well, you know, as a matter of fact, I hope you got, this is a pamphlet about my foundation. We're always looking for partners. We're looking for volunteers who want to come help out and teach English or technology. So if you have any interest about that, please pick one of these up or go to our website, marinaorthfoundation.org, and see if there's a way you might want to have a wonderful experience in Colombia. And I also think that would be one thing, but I think that the Peace Corps has 3 goals when the original Peace Corps bill was written, and that was to send Americans to serve overseas. It was also for the people overseas to see what Americans were really like. And do I have time to tell one quick?
Of course you do.
When a year ago on September 11th of 2011, I was in this very remote Moroccan village, and very, very Muslim, devout Muslim village. And there was a Peace Corps volunteer there, and he had helped a young man in the village who was an artist who had been just scoffed at because he didn't paint totally realistically. And the Peace Corps volunteer, apart from his job as a youth coordinator working with all these different sports programs and stuff, had helped this young artist. And his parents and his family were so grateful that when they heard we were coming to do a thing about this, a postcard about this volunteer, they had us come and they prepared their best feast for us. And the one thing that the politicians there do is that they give everybody they give people satellite dishes. So even if you have these huts that you live in, you've got satellite TV. And so they turned on the TV, and it was a ceremony for Ground Zero, and Paul Simon singing The Sounds of Silence. And I was so overwhelmed to be sitting there with my shoes off, about to have this feast from this very grateful, very traditional Muslim family. And it just seemed to me that had we had 200,000, President Kennedy's original idea was 100,000 people a year would go into the Peace Corps. And I think had we had that, I really question whether we would have had 9/11. I really feel deeply about that. And I don't think and the Peace Corps has been in both Jordan and Morocco for 40 years, and those are the 2 Middle Eastern countries that are the most stable and like Americans the best.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. I would also mention, if you want to think of, if you're inclined to help, in addition to speaking to your elected representatives, peacecorps.gov is the Peace Corps website, and they are now willing to take donations and support for individual projects. So you can choose a country or a type of work and see what kinds of things are underway. I took a look at Ethiopia. There are 3 projects there, 2 on literacy and 1 to build a track. And you might find it in your hearts to support that. I'd also like to mention that, and I should have had a slide on this, I'm now a photographer, and I have a photo website I'd like to invite you to visit, michaelmccaskey.com. And what's of particular interest is a photo essay on the trip back to Ethiopia. I had to cover in my remarks here today just very quickly. There are a few more pages, a few more photos, and I invite you to go take a look at it. Thank you all very much for coming. Great to be with you today.